Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Franchise Hockey Manager 9 playthrough of the Chicago Blackhawks. We are at the beginning of the 2029 offseason. The Blackhawks had a very successful 28-29 regular season, winning the President's Trophy with the best record in the National Hockey League. Unfortunately, the Stanley Cup playoffs were not as successful for the Blackhawks. We were bounced in an epic 7-game series by the Dallas Stars in the Western Conference semifinals, and the Stars went on to lose in the Stanley Cup finals to the Montreal Canadiens. So that is where we are. The Blackhawks are a team built to win right now. We've already made offers at the beginning of this offseason to a few of our young players who are potentially restricted free agents. Taking a look at the roster, we've got two significant players that are free agents this year that we are extremely unlikely to bring back. But you can see that we've got a 23-man roster put together right now with about $77.9 million in terms of salary. So we do have a small bit of ability to take on some contracts in the coming months through free agency and or trades. The player I think we are most likely to move on from right now to open up a little bit more money to potentially improve the roster is left winger Yegor Sharangovich. He's been with us for 2 years now. Brought him on expecting some potentially dynamic offensive playmaking from him. And he's been fine, given that he's been playing most often on the third line with 43 points a year ago, 38 this past season. But you can see his ice time dropped dramatically from his first year with us to the second. He's making close to $5 million a year. He's 31 years old. He's in the last year of his contract. And he also, unfortunately for Yegor, is the only unpopular player on our team with his teammates. So we've got a real good locker room right now. Our job security is really high following a successful year, at least during the regular season last season. Fans are generally pretty pleased with what we're doing. But I think there is an opportunity to potentially improve the edges of our roster if we let Sharangovich go. Looking at the key free agents who are going to be available this offseason, the one big star out there is Kent Johnson, 26-year-old center/left winger. Scored 39 goals last year for Columbus. Would certainly be a dynamic player for us, but as we have talked about in previous episodes, and some of you have mentioned frequently in the comments, we are carrying a surplus of excellent centers at this point. And we could certainly bring Johnson on board and try to convert him to a left winger. He's certainly more than capable of doing that. And with $7.2 million, we could potentially fit him on the roster if we were to trade away Sharangovich. But I'm not sure if that is the right play for us. We will also have the draft coming up in a few days, which will be very exciting for us because we have not had a first-round pick for 2 consecutive years. Traded them both away to bring the young star goaltender Jesper Wellstedt to our team. But that now was 3 seasons ago, so we will finally have a first-round pick again this year. It'll clearly be near the end of the first round after the successful season we had last year. But still good to hopefully bring a little bit of fresh blood into our system. We do have several good young players on the team at this point, several of whom, in the cases of Villeneuve and Eklund, are signed to relatively long-term contracts. But we don't have a ton in the AHL or the ECHL, or just in terms of players that we have rights to that's real high-quality talent at this point, given that we haven't had a first-round draft pick since 2026. So hopefully we'll be able to bring a little more talent on board through the draft. So I don't think, even if we do move on from Sharangovich, that we're going to be making more than one significant move this offseason in terms of free agents. Question is whether we want to try to go for one potentially big-time player or maybe fill in the margins of the roster with a couple players if we do move on from Sharangovich. And there's not a ton of interest in Sharangovich. We shopped him. We only got 3 trade offers. The only one that's a pure draft pick is from the Red Wings, a 4th rounder. I do think we're going to go ahead and make that trade. Want to free up a little bit of cash, give us a little bit of optionality going into the off-season. And, of course, it does also help now that there are no unpopular players on the team. So that now puts us in a position where if we want to go after Johnson, we can. And it also probably puts us into a position where if we want to try to maybe bring 2 forwards on board, we've potentially got the option to do that as well. I did mention that we have a couple relatively big players who were free agents. One of them, Adrian Kemp, who's been with us for the last couple years, aging right winger that we are going to move on from. And the other player has been with us even longer. Drew Comesso is also a free agent from our team, but not as significant of an impact since he's basically been in the minors for us most of his time with us. And I guess it would do a little better if I would maybe just screen for the defenseman. But Rasmus Andersson is a defenseman who has been with us for several seasons now, who is now a free agent, 32 years old also, just like Kemp, at a point in his career where he's definitely starting to decline. And I do feel that with the likes of Quinn Hughes, Kevin Korchinski, Xavier Veilleux, who made his NHL debut in the playoffs for us, Matteo Rotundi and Luke Coughlin, who we picked in the first round, our first year managing this team, along with Sam Rinzel and another Ricky Roy Chung, feel like we've got a pretty good blue line, so we can move on from Rasmus Andersson and likely focus our attention this offseason on improving our forwards, particularly our wingers. I think Byfield and Matty Beniers are likely to be our top 2 centers this year. Dylan Larkin, who we did sign to an extension, coming off a great season with 46 goals and 39 assists. But we could potentially move him with that skill set to be maybe our second line left winger. Because right now when we look at our lines, and again, this is just the AI default, not necessarily saying everything here is completely accurate, and obviously we need to change it now that we traded away Sharangovich, but we've kind of got Larkin in as our third line center, and I think potentially he would be a much better second line left winger in terms of delivering some offense than Paul Cotter is. So things could still change depending on who we decide to go after in the offseason, but I think ensuring that Byfield, Beniers, and Larkin are all on the first 2 lines is one of the things that we're going to focus on as we try to build the team this offseason. And as I think about free agency, I kind of see 2 different scenarios we could follow. One would be to go after Kent Johnson, who's the best player out there. Would certainly be a nice addition to our team. Pretty strong in every area, mental, physical, and offensive ratings, excellent. And even defensively, in terms of his stick checking, his defensive read, his positioning, pretty good with face-offs. Not the most physical player in the world, but still a pretty solid two-way forward. But primarily a prolific scorer with 39 goals and 81 points in 68 games last year, playing over 20 minutes a game on the ice. So that would be one option. The negative is that it gives us another natural center. Now, he's probably the most effective of them at left wing, so we would probably move him to become our first line left winger or possibly our second line left winger. But the other option would be bringing on two players that are somewhat more versatile. Alex Bouquet, pretty good offensive player, pretty sound physically, pretty sound mentally. I'd say he's more balanced defensively than Kent Johnson, but not as good in a few facets, but he's also not as bad in a few facets. He's a 27-year-old coming off of a 36-goal season, and he scored over 30 goals for 3 straight years. Thing that I like about him is that he's a natural winger, right winger, left wing, where we potentially have some holes. And when I look at our roster, our number one right winger, Mitch Marner, is in the final year of his contract. He's our captain. But he's also getting up there. He's 32 years old at this point. You can see his production, in part due to injuries, has moved from 29 goals to 21 to 18 over the last couple of seasons. And if we talk about extension with him, he's looking for over $10 million a year in 4 years. So I think it's going to be pretty hard for us to bring Mitch Marner back. And as I talked about earlier, we've also lost Adrian Kemp at right wing. So behind Marner, we've got Shields, who is a really good young player, and then Frank Nazar and Jordan Forget, who are young players, probably second or third line players in a best case scenario. And you could argue that in a perfect world, they're probably third and fourth liners, which is what they are today. But given that there's almost no chance we're going to have Marner back next year, that does kind of push me towards thinking more seriously about Bouquet, even though he's not as good as Kent Johnson, because if we did bring him on board, we would also potentially bring on board a very versatile forward, Matthias Leferrier, who's really good at right wing and center, can play left wing for us. Not as spectacular as either Johnson or Bouquet in terms of his skills. 29-year-old, so he's older than either of them, but kind of a nice, solid third or fourth line player who can basically play anywhere on the front line for us. Leferrier, for reference, is looking for less than $2 million a year for 3 years. And then Bouquet, looking for about $5 million for 3 years. So essentially we could sign both of those players for less than it would cost to bring on Kent Johnson. And Bouquet in particular gives us a little bit of insurance at right wing against the pending loss of Kemp and the potential loss of Marner after this season, as well as, quite honestly, the potential loss of Shields and Forget also. We've got a hole at right wing that is potentially coming. We did investigate potentially making an offer to Shields. He's looking for a lot of money too. Almost $5 million a year for 3 years. But I think that's a contract that is potentially one that makes a lot more sense than bringing Marner back for over $10 million. And we have made an offer to Forget already. He will be a restricted free agent to try to bring him, and then the defensemen Veyu and Chung back. They're all restricted free agents, so not potentially going to be making real huge money for any of them this time around. But I feel like right wing is potentially a critical position for us, and it's one that has quite honestly kind of been a problem. I don't want to say a problem, but it's been probably our biggest weakness for the last several years. And with 3 free agents or potential free agents next year, including our captain and an extremely expensive player, and the fact that we've already lost Kemp, who did kind of have his best year while on the team for us this past season. We're not going to bring him back. But he did have 20 goals in 75 games for us, as opposed to the real poor start he got off when we traded for him midway through the 27 and 28 season. So that's certainly a loss also, losing him. He's looking for $4.6 million, though. And honestly, I would feel a lot better bringing on someone like Bocage than Kemp at this point for somewhat similar money. And as much as I like to bring top-end talent onto our team, when I look at our potential lines for next year with Eklund, Byfield, and Marner on the first line, Larkin if he moves to left wing along with Beniers and Shields on the second line, I'd love to bring on Kent Johnson, but that essentially means that Larkin or Beniers is going to end up on a third line for us, which is just kind of a waste. Beniers ended up being our third line center last year behind Byfield and Larkin, and ended up not really producing anywhere near what we would have expected from him with just 38 points in 72 games. And you can see he only averaged less than 14 minutes a game on the ice, which is just kind of a waste. I mean, he's in the final year of his contract with us, so we could argue that why do we care about getting him playing time? But he's a young, dynamic player. And I feel if we bring Johnson on board, that just ensures that one of these guys, Larkin or Beniers, that we're spending a lot of money on, is going to end up being a third-line player for us, not getting a ton of playing time. So I think it's the right move to focus on right wing. Now, it may mean that Shields, who's also a pretty darn good offensive player, but he also brings a lot to the table defensively and physically, so I wouldn't feel horrible if he's playing the third line for us next year at the age of 23, even though probably means he'll get a little less ice time than he has the last couple years. But as I talked about, our right wing position is definitely not as deep as some others, and is potentially in a lot of transition. That's why I think bringing on Alex Bocage and potentially making him our second-line right winger is probably the best move for this team for the long term. So we're going to make an offer to him, looking for 3 years, a little over $5 million. Obviously, we're not going to offer him that much because we never do. We're going to see if we can lock him up for a little less money and a little longer, try to get a fourth year out of him at $4.85 million, so about $200,000 a year less than he's looking for. He's willing to think about it. So we're going to submit the offer to him, and then we are also going to make the offer to Laferriere. Like his versatility, think that he's a pretty solid third or fourth line player for us who, again, can play certainly right wing and center with a high degree of proficiency, and is at least competent as a left winger. Not looking for a ton of money. We'll offer him $1.75 million a year for 3 years. Wants a little more, we'll up it to $1.85. Submit the offer to him. So, I mean, we're still looking at 2 relatively top-end free agents in Bocage and Laferriere. but not going right at the top end of the market this year with Kent Johnson. We did think about a couple of these young Russian players, Nikita Onashenko and Maxim Ilyachov. Neither of them spoke English, and we mentioned that we had just gotten rid of the unpopular Sharangovich, who was the only Belarusian in our clubhouse and was unpopular with the others. We don't have any Russian players on the team, so we don't have any veterans to kind of hopefully ease either of those players into the lineup. So I think just in terms of potential locker room cohesion and getting players who can potentially get up the curve right away and fit in really well, bringing on the Canadians, Bocage and Laferriere potentially, is the direction that we are going to try to go. So not going right at the top end of the market with Kent Johnson this year, but think if we bring on Bocage and Laferriere, probably fill in the holes on our team. Bocage would obviously, as we talked about, be a second or third line right winger behind Marner and possibly Shields for us. And it would also allow us, if we bring on both of those players, to potentially move Linus Eriksson down to the AHL or move on from a Jordan Forget, who's a right winger who can only play right wing. So it gives us a little optionality potentially with our third and fourth lines to make them a little deeper and more versatile and better, I think, this year, if we're able to bring both of these free agents on board. And the initial feedback, at least from both Bocage and Laferriere, is positive. Veilleux, Chung, and Forget signed their contracts. They were, as I said, young, restricted, potential free agents, so no shock that they want to sign with us. We also made an offer to Thomas Vesely, who was our second-round pick a few years ago. I think that he is a player who could potentially also be helping us on the front line. Probably not this coming season, only 20 years old. Certainly looks like he's a potentially dynamic offensive player. Mental skills still have a little bit of work to do. But a guy who, particularly if he gets over to the United States, maybe gets to know English a little better over the next year or two, is a player who, if we do sign him, could be helping us in the not so distant future, but probably not this upcoming season. And we did get Vesely signed as we approach the draft lottery. Not that we're going to be involved in that, but that's tomorrow, and then the draft is in 2 days. Still haven't heard anything further back from either of the free agents that we're chasing after, but would be nice to potentially get both of them locked up. And then, quite honestly, I think most of our work for the summer would be done if we get both of them on board. And the draft is now ready to begin. The Sharks, the Senators, and the Islanders with the first 3 picks. We will not be picking until 28th, but as I mentioned, we haven't had a number 1 pick or a first-round pick in 3 years now, so it will be nice to actually get hopefully some top-end talent that will be hopefully producing for us at the NHL level in a few seasons in the draft this year. And hopefully we can get a solid player with some potential here at the 28th pick in the draft. But certainly, according to our scouts, no real top-end talent left. 3-star potential. Then there's only 3 players with that type of potential left. One is the American goalie Mike Wilson, a young guy, 18 years old, played in the OHL this past season. My big concern with him is that physically, he's only 18 years old, and he's pretty fragile or vulnerable in terms of his physical skills or his kind of injury tendencies and his health. So that's definitely a red flag. Right defenseman Tuomas Ranta has a long way to go. He's only 17 years old. Certainly has some potential, but he is a long way off from being an NHL player, as you would expect for most 17-year-olds. And there's also the German Tobias Rettig, versatile winger that our scouts like a lot more than consensus. I think we've probably got the best scouts in the world at this point, so I would tend to favor what our scouts say. He's projected to be the 96th pick in the draft, though I do kind of feel, since our scouts are so much higher on Rettig than most people are, that maybe we could get him in the second round, possibly even in the third round, although I really wouldn't push it that far, given that, according to our scouts, he's one of only three-star potential players out there. But probably not going to go with any of these three guys in the first round. Going to do a little more digging and seeing what our scouts think more deeply, looking at the scouting reports, and see if maybe we can find maybe a safer pick here for the first round, and then hope that Rettig falls to us in the second round, where I believe we've got two picks. Yeah, we've got our own, and we've got Boston's in the second round. So certainly would think that with Rettig at number 96 in the mock draft, and the fact that we're so much more positive on him than most people are, we can probably pick him up with one of our second round picks. And here in the first round, we're kind of focused in on a couple of Canadian players who have really fallen. Tyler Jones and Corey Downing were projected in the mock draft to go 5th and 6th. You can see our scouts don't see them as having tons of potential. But Tyler Jones in particular is a pretty dynamic offensive player. As a 17-year-old, he just scored 46 goals in the WHL. His physical skills aren't great. His mental ratings are all over the map, and his temperament is not good at all. But defensively, he's okay. He's a guy to think about if we want to kind of really roll the dice. Corey Downing is a similar but somewhat more balanced profile, was projected to go 6th overall. Very good potential offensive player, scored 32 goals for Everett as a 17-year-old. And while he's got a lot of growth that needs to take place physically to be ready for the NHL, he brings somewhat more consistency to the table defensively and in terms of his mental ratings than Jones does. So I think we're going to take a flyer on one of those guys. Our scout thinks that they are not as good as consensus. Tyler Jones, in terms of the scouting report, pretty positive, gets along well with everyone, doesn't let criticism get him down, thrives on the spotlight. Lower body a little bit vulnerable. Corey Downing, in terms of the personality, also enjoys the spotlight, wants to make a lot of money, scores high on IQ tests. Pretty normal in terms of his injury tendencies. Little more confidence in the scouting grade as far as his development from our scouts than we are with Jones, but given that we don't necessarily have a huge number on either of these guys, I don't know if that's really positive or negative. I think that Downing is a little more balanced as a prospect. So I think we're going to go here with Downing in the first round. Got to go back to the screen. So we'll take the guy who was projected to be the 6th pick in the draft. Maybe he was taken. I thought he hadn't been taken. Yeah, he's still available, isn't he? why won't it let me draft him? Guess I maybe need to get to the actual draft screen to do that. All right, so there's Downing there. And we're going to pick Downing and then see what happens with our next pick. Jones is still available here in the second round using that pick from Boston. So if we really want to gamble here at pick 49, we could do that. Taking a look at the higher potential players, and it looks like actually the supposed 3-star potential guys that we saw out there are gone now. So we maybe should have taken one of them in the first round, because going through the rest of the draft, it looks like Redig was actually taken in the first round. I guess somebody else was pretty high on him. Tuomas Ranta went shortly after him. And then the goalie Mike Wilson went relatively early in the second round. So may have gambled a little bit with those guys, but here in the second round, Tyler Jones can put the puck in the back of the net. Whether or not he's going to develop physically to be a NHL player, I don't know. And he does seem to be a little bit of a loose cannon at this point in his career. But he is only 18 years old. He's 6'3", 225. As a second-round flyer, I think Tyler Jones is not a bad direction to go. So we are going to pick him, move on, and we'll be picking again about 10 picks later. And there's really even not a lot here towards the end of the second round. We're just going to go with who our scouts think has the most potential, which is the goalie Alf Takala. Played in Spokane last year at the age of 18. 9-8 record, 385 goals against average. Young goalie. He's got some potential. Scouts do think he's a little bit slow, but don't mind taking a flyer on a young goalie, especially given that he's the only player left that our scouts think have any level of potential to maybe be a NHL player down the line. So we are through the draft. I don't think we're going to have anyone who's going to help us anytime soon, but most importantly, we have got Alex Bocage as well as Matthias Laferriere signed. So we've got our 2 targets in free agency, and the big work of our offseason is done now with the draft behind us and the 2 players we signed as free agents. Clearly going to need to figure out what where we want to play those guys. But we're going to be just under the salary cap, and the trade market didn't look like there was all that much out there when I checked on that. I haven't shown it to all of you. Obviously doesn't mean we can't make a trade for someone who's not on the trade block. Actually, there are some interesting players on there now that we've gotten a little further through. It looks like there's a ton of goalies who are available on the trade block. Actually, it's changed a lot since I looked at it right at the start of the offseason. Fair number of really highly regarded players who are available, but obviously most of these players are making pretty significant money. Cole Schwint might be an interesting player to potentially bring on board in the last year of his contract. Another right winger not making a ton of money. But I am assuming that the Flames are probably going to want a fair amount for him. But we'll at least explore it, see how much it would take. So yes, while there is now some pretty interesting talent available on the trade block, none of these players are really going to be given away. Did investigate Cole Schwint because at that number we could have probably fit him onto the roster, but even 3 first-round picks plus some decent young players was not enough to get that done. So it looks like he's really just on the market to see if Calgary can completely hold somebody up to bring him on board. With that $3.4 million contract, though, could have gotten him on to the roster. So we'll keep an eye on the trade market over the course of the rest of the offseason, but with the recent additions of Bocage and Laferriere to bolster our right wing position, I think we are probably largely done at this point. You can see, as we talked about, we got Vayu, Chung, and Forget re-signed. Now kind of need to start thinking about some of the guys in the final year of their contracts who we might be able to bring back. Marner at $10 million, pretty unlikely. What's Matty Beniers looking for? He's looking for a pretty good raise to $8 million a year for 5 years. Now that we're going to have him on the second line most likely this coming year, would like to kind of see if we can get a little more production out of him. Definitely someone to think about. Cole Sillinger, the center, another pretty good player, looking for $6.5 million a year for 3 years, though. He's a guy who only played 10 minutes a game for us last year because we've got such great depth at center. But clearly, if we lose Beniers, he'd move up. But I think that maybe getting the right winger Will Shields, the 23-year-old, locked up. Decent personality. Actually, we should check on team harmony after those players that we brought in. Doesn't look like we've caused any problems with the 2 guys that we brought on board. As I talked about, I do think right wing is a potential hole for us next year. Certainly with the fact that we now have brought on a couple of guys who are primarily right wingers, not the hole that it was. But given that Marner's not going to be back, I think it probably does make sense to try to sign Will Shields right now. He is going to be a restricted free agent. The number, I think, has gone down a little bit to around 4.8. So we're going to auto-qualify him and see if maybe we can get him on board for somewhat less than he's looking for. I don't think there's any guarantees that we're going to get this done with the kind of numbers we're going to offer him. He's looking for close to 4.8 for 3 years. See if we can get him at $4.5 million for 4 years. He is willing to go to the 4th year, just wants a little more money. How about 4.6 for 4 years, Will? 4.7 will do it. Let's split the difference, Will. Come on, let's get this done now, buddy. He's not thrilled with it, but he's a restricted guy. I tend to think he'll probably sign it. And we have got Will Shields signed, so that gives us some depth, and at least between Shields and the recently acquired Bocage probably gives us our first and second line right wingers for next year in the event that, in the probably likely event that we do move on from Mitch Marner this offseason. And it is kind of interesting that Kent Johnson is still out there a week into free agency. His actual demands have come down from about $7.2 million to about $6.4 million, but not a player that we can afford at this point, unless we were to make other significant moves to the team. We are getting to the point where, we'll look for someone with some high potential. We just made an offer to Enver Vujanin, young goalie out of Sweden. And we're going to make an offer to Henry Muse, who is a restricted free agent from the Canadiens. Would think that they are going to match that offer, but I think he's a kind of versatile player, a right defenseman / center, which is definitely an interesting combination, but he can play just about anywhere on the ice. Hard to imagine that the Canadiens will not match our offer. So we're going to try to make the Canadiens spend a little bit of money. Says he's looking for $2.481 million a year for 5 years. We'll offer $2.75 million for 5 years. Let's see what that'd require a second-round pick. That's fine. Make the Canadiens spend a little money to try to defend their title. And I am with the fact that Kent Johnson is still out on the market, at least thinking about making a big move. The thought is, we know Matty Beniers is looking for around $8 million if we're to sign him past this year. He's basically the exact same age as Kent Johnson. These guys are basically the same age. Looking at their offensive ratings, they're very close. I don't know that I strongly favor one over the other. Defensively, they're pretty close also. Matty Beniers may be a little more consistent. Physical ratings maybe favor Beniers a tiny bit, but again, they're really close. And then the mental ratings, again, they're pretty darn close. Thing I like about potentially bringing on Kent Johnson is we'd be locking him in for several years at less money than Beniers is making now, and much less money than Beniers is going to be making in the future. And we might be able to use Matty Beniers to get something for us. The other thing that would be nice is that Johnson is a pretty solid left winger. He's honestly better at this point at left wing than Dylan Larkin. So that would actually allow us to move Larkin back to center as a veteran on this team. And then put Johnson out to left wing. But more importantly, get a player locked up for several years, given that I think it's going to be pretty hard for us to bring Matty Beniers back next year. So I think I'm going to actually throw out an offer to Kent Johnson right now. And if we can bring him on board, the Matty Beniers experiment may just be a one-year deal for the Blackhawks. He's looking for $6.41 million for 6 years. See, about $6.15 million for 6 years. We'll give him the no movement clause. And he wants a little more, of course. 6.25. All right. Thought we weren't going to go after the biggest free agent available again this year, but maybe we will. And that didn't take long. Kent Johnson is signed. Henry Muse, the Canadiens did, not surprisingly, match that offer sheet. And the goalie I mentioned, Enver Vushinin, signed with the Bruins rather than us. But we've got Kent Johnson on board now, and we've got him on board for 6 years at less money than we were paying Matty Beniers. So I think it's time to see what we can get for Mr. Beniers. I mean, I guess another option would be to trade away Mitch Marner. But we're a team that's trying to win right now. I don't think trading away our veteran captain is a smart decision, even if he may leave at the end of this year. But I think it's Matty Beniers or Cole Sillinger. We could trade him too and get the salary back under where we need it to be. So we've got some options to think about. I mean, honestly, we could go to a somewhat lower priced player also. Frank Nazar, moving on from him, would not quite get us under the cap. It would be oh so close. That would be an obvious move to make, and then try to keep both of those guys. But maybe a little aggressive. Sillinger could be the odd man out. Looking for $6.5 million a year next year. I do like the fact that he's a really good defensive player. I think he kind of fits better in that third or fourth line for us than Beniers potentially would. But we've got some decisions to make with the fact that we just keep obsessively adding talented free agents to our team each offseason. And I had thought about doing a lot of mechanics and adjusting and manipulation of the roster to try to be able to keep Matty Beniers, but I think he's the right guy to try to get rid of. And it seems like we can potentially get 2 first-rounders from Pittsburgh. Now, they're a good team, so we're making them 31 and 32 first-rounders rather than this upcoming 2030 season, hoping that maybe they can't get Matty Beniers signed to a long-term extension and they move in the wrong direction over the next couple of years and those picks get more valuable. But our scouts think they'll probably accept that offer. So we're going to go ahead and offer Matty Beniers to them. And hopefully we'll find out what happens shortly. It basically came down to I felt like we needed to move on from Beniers or Sillinger in terms of guys who are in the final year of their contract and looking to make a decent amount of money. And as I talked about, I just think Sillinger is a better defensive player, and given that either of those as guys at this point is going to be a third or fourth line player for us, I just like the physicality of Sillinger. And he's also looking for less money and extension, so I think there's more of a chance that we could bring Sillinger back next year than Beniers. But as I talked about, Kent Johnson is basically the same age as him and a pretty similar player who we've now got locked up for less money for 6 years. So I think we're making the right long-term move, and I think it's a pretty neutral short-term move bringing Kent Johnson on board. But if you have other opinions, I'd certainly love to hear them in the comments down below. And I'm sure you'll let me know if you disagree. And I thank you for that. And the Penguins did accept that offer for Beniers, so I think we have to do this. We're basically getting... I think you could argue that Beniers is a better player, but we're getting 95% of the player that he is in Kent Johnson, at least, for less money. And we're locking him up for longer term. And then we're able to add 2 first-round picks. Granted, they're probably going to be in the 20s, but there's still some value there. I think it's a move that we have to make, and given that we've already brought Johnson on board, we don't really have much choice. So we're going to go ahead and complete that trade. And certainly the locker room looks different now, but still seems pretty harmonious. Job security certainly took a hit. When we traded away, or not job security, but fan happiness. Although Sharangovich was unpopular in the locker room, apparently he was popular in the fans. We did increase ticket prices for our first and upcoming season in the newly constructed Old School Sports Arena. Kind of got things moving back in the good direction with our first round pick and bringing on Bocage and then Kent Johnson. But the fans not happy that we lost Matty Beniers either. So a little worse than we started off in terms of fan happiness after this real active first couple weeks of the off season. But I think the team is better now than it was. And that's the goal, since we are in a win now mode with these Blackhawks. And with the money that we have freed up from moving on from Matty Beniers, we do have potential to make another move to bolster our defense. We were going to go with the rookie Roy Chung as our 7th defenseman this year. But I know some of you mentioned in the comments of previous episodes that if there was a way for us to keep David Jarachik, we should think about it. And he is still a free agent at this point. And we could fit him under the cap if we brought him back. I really just want to compare them and see. He'd be about $2.7 million, so he certainly wouldn't be cheap. Question is, how much better is he than Chung at this point? Kind of looking through the offensive ratings, they're pretty similar players. Defensively, again, pretty similar. Not a huge difference. Physical ratings, on balance, favor Chung a little bit. The mental ratings, perhaps not surprisingly, favor, in my view, Jarachik a bit. So they're pretty even players. Now, Jarachik is definitely more proficient at playing left defense than Chung is right now, but given that we've got Chung for around $850,000 this year, I think $834,000, and we just signed him to that extension for $1.35 million for the next 3 years. As much as I could argue that the versatility of Jarachik right now makes him a little bit more valuable, we're talking about a 7th defenseman, and he's looking for $2.88 million, a little more than I had thought. You can see we tried to give him a 2-way contract, but he didn't go for that, not surprisingly. But I just don't think he's a big enough upgrade from Chung to be spending around an extra $2 million a year on. So I don't mind going into the season potentially with a little bit of dry powder as far as the salary cap, because this is a team that we think is built to win now. If we happen to have a big injury that wipes somebody out during the season, we've got some capacity to take on some contracts. And quite honestly, with those 2 number 1 picks that we picked up when we traded away Matty Beniers, we've also got the ammunition to potentially bring on a difference maker several months from now when we get closer to the trade deadline, particularly if we have a big hole to fill. So I think at this point I'm kind of thinking if we're not done with what we're going to do this offseason, we're getting real close to that point. And taking a look at our development report for the month of July, not a shock that the aging veterans Larkin and Marner kind of moving in the wrong direction. Top-selling NHL jerseys are new additions, very popular. Kent Johnson, the number 1 jersey in the NHL. Alex Bocage, number 3. And then Shields, Wallstedt, Quinn Hughes, and the captain, Mitch Marner, also remain quite popular. So the Blackhawks are selling a lot of jerseys, and we're expecting to have a lot of fans in the seats at the Old School Sports Arena when it opens in a couple of months. And we've made it to the month of September, and we are close to the start of the preseason. I guess with 2030 coming up, it's going to be an Olympic year, so we're going to get the season started very early this year. Preseason starts on September 7th, and we're actually going to have regular season games here, or one regular season game here at the end of September on the 29th. So it's time to figure out who's going to come into camp, and I don't think we're going to have a ton of difficult roster decisions to make. Kind of feel like the 23 guys who we have on the roster right now with a salary of less than just under $78 million. Probably going to be who we break camp with, but we'll certainly bring some other players into camp and hopefully have some tough decisions to make as we get through the preseason. And we're getting near the end of the preseason and a pretty significant injury. One of our big free agent acquisitions, Alex Bocage, severe eye trauma, going to be out for 4 months. So that is not great, clearly. Tyson Buksowski also has a strained PCL. He was unlikely to make the big club, but clearly not great to have him injured. And then Victor Eklund is dealing with a much less significant injury, simply a sore groin. But Bocage is going to go on to the injury list, where he will be until well into 2030, unfortunately. Hopefully the other injuries are not as significant. Buksowski, we're going to just send down to Rockford. He's not going to make the big club. We'll let them put him on the IL there. You can see we've still got 32 players in camp at this point. Only 2 games left at Nashville and home against Pittsburgh. Have had a nice performance on the ice with a 4-1 record in our 5 games, but clearly losing one of our big acquisitions from this past offseason for likely the first half of the year is not the way that we were hoping to finish up training camp. And with training camp getting close to a close, we'll take a look at our development. Had a lot of our young guys in camp, obviously. Sasha Boisvert, probably not going to make the team. Roy Chung, who will. Coughlin, who will. Dubé, who will. Eklund, who will. All getting better. Linus Eriksson, definitely on the bubble, along with Jordan Forget. Although that injury to Bocage could help Forget stay up with the big club. Forlin, Jekko, Kanyan, unlikely to make the big team. Korchinski, Will, Mays certainly on the bubble. Nazar, again, a much better chance with that injury to Bocage. Cole Sillinger, of course, will make the team. Have a decision to make on the youngster we signed, who we had drafted a couple years ago in Vesely, and then Nathan Villeneuve clearly will make the team. Only one guy going in the wrong direction. It's an important guy, the veteran center Dylan Larkin, who scored 46 goals for us last year. He's going to be moving down to the second line this year, probably a little less ice time than he's had in the past. Hopefully that'll help us to keep him healthy, and he'll still be a pretty productive offensive player. Season ticket numbers for the new arena, 18,600. That's a little down, I think, from where we've been, although I can't remember for sure. We're still the number 1 team in season tickets in the new old school sports arena, so that's good news. Should be making a lot of money. Let's hope that we just stay healthy these last couple games at Nashville and then home against Pittsburgh, and then we will start preparing for the regular season to begin. And as we get ready to break camp, we won those final 2 games, including a 3-0 shutout over the Penguins. Kent Johnson, the addition, we've been playing him at left wing throughout. You can see he's still center is his primary position, but did kind of pick up a point in his proficiency at left wing, and would expect over the first month of the season for him to kind of move to becoming a natural left winger, which should help us. No more injuries at this point. Eklund's still dealing with that day-to-day groin. He will clearly be back in about a week and a half when the season gets started. Unfortunately, we're going to be down Bocage for a while, but hopefully he'll be back and healthy. Kind of interesting after the guy played exactly 80 games a year for Washington with over 30 goals a season each of the last 3 years that we are going to not have him for a full year in his first year with us with that big contract. But I think we've got the depth to handle it. Obviously, Marner is our first line winger. There will be no debate about our second line. That would have been a debate between Bocage and Shields. And then we've got Laferriere, who we brought on board, as well as Forget and Nazar, likely fighting for that fourth line spot in the right wing position. So we've definitely got 9 cuts to make to get the salary under the cap and to get our roster set for the start of the regular season. And clearly there could be a lot of interesting stuff going on in waivers. And we were going to have money to potentially take on contracts anyways. And now with the fact that Bocage is going to be on the injured list to start the season, and we know he's going to be out for several months, might make us a little more likely to take a flyer on someone who's available in waivers. So we will find out what the waiver wire looks like and work on making our final cuts, and most importantly, get the 2029 to 2030 season started and underway in our next episode. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.